A good evening. Welcome to NTV On The Spot. My name is Raymond Ujini, filling in for Kamara, who's still away. And today we have a very rare privilege to interview the Senior Counsel, Professor Frederick Sempebwa. Thank you so much for giving us the time today to talk to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me.
All right. Professor, I want us to start the conversation from the national election that just ended, the presidential election particularly. What were your own thoughts about that election?
Well, this has been a unique election, first of all, because of the health conditions in which the campaigns were held, which meant that the freedom of candidates to campaign, to interface with the people was limited. It's also been unique because we had a new party, a new registered party competing and coming out with a very, very strong support as evidenced by the results. That's quite surprising, because there are older established parties which were very popular, especially FDC, which everyone thought would be the strongest opposition to the ruling party, CCM. So this has been unique, and we are waiting to see, because as you know there's a challenge in court, we are waiting to see what the results will be. So we cannot comment on the details, the successes, the failures, of this or that one, because these are matters that will be dealt with in the courts of law, not only at the presidential petition level, but I'm sure there will be a number of challenges for parliamentary successes, against parliamentary successes.
Professor, you mentioned that this was a unique election because of the health concern that was there, the COVID-19. One of the issues that came out during the election was candidates being unable to meet the voters, then made it impossible for them to sell their manifesto to the voters, and made it impossible for the voters to choose who their candidate should be. Would you have agreed with people who suggested that the election should have been postponed?
Well, there was a bit of difficulty in postponing an election because of the constitutional impasse that would arise. It was a very difficult decision to take. I think what was taken was the best in my view, except that it was necessary to ensure that there was complete freedom for every player in the field to use the available means, the media, electronic as well as print, to reach the population. If the playing field was level, then everyone would be disadvantaged and advantaged at the same level. Yeah.
Professor, what does a level playing field look like? What does it actually mean?
It means that relatively people at the same receive the same treatment and have the same opportunities, similar opportunities to reach the population. If we are going to use the media, you and me should have equal opportunity to use the media without due interference. If, as was proposed, the physical interaction, it was limited to a group of people in view of COVID, then everyone should have had the same advantage taken of that physical appearance. Of course, you could not have completely level playing field in theory, like the presidential election. The president, the incumbent president, of course, is in a special place. He has national duties, and when he's carrying out these duties during the campaign, there is a perception of using that opportunity as a leverage over other candidates. That perception will always be there unless there is a constitutional device that is satisfactory. So far, a number of devices have been proposed, but none has been thought to be satisfactory.
Professor, the design of the Constitution itself gives the president such enormous power in this election, running up to the presidential poll. The president sacked officials of the Electoral Commission who are conducting an election. The president remains the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, so by design he can order them in operation areas. That in itself makes it impossible to have a level playing field. Are you suggesting that the Constitution needs to rein in on that?
Well, that is the perception I've talked about, but the solution so far has not been found. That is the perception, because you have a president, an incumbent president, who is also competing, and one only expects that all candidates, including the current president, would conform to the rules and the laws that are in place that require equal treatment. Now, when you ask me whether I'm suggesting for Constitution to deal with this, if there was a feasible solution, I would agree. But we've been scratching our heads all the time, and we haven't reached a feasible solution. Do you ask the president to step down and leave the place for some interim president? That might not be very feasible. So what else can you do? Well, that's something that is worth putting in a conversation when we have the opportunity.
Professor, let's talk about the Constitution. Are there any regrets you have of the Constitution you designed years later?
Absolutely no regret in the instrument that we drafted and approved. It was approved by the Constituent Assembly. The only regrets that I can see arise out of the various amendments that have been put on this Constitution. That is one. The other regret is, of course, the practice, which has meant that certain principles enshrined in the Constitution are no longer effective. The amendments include the removal of the term limits, which to me was very, very fundamental to the constitutional development of this country, because there wouldn't be a lot of controversy if we had stayed with that provision. So that is one of the regrets. The other, of course, as I said, is the constitutional practice, the political practice, which appears to have tilted a number of practices that were enshrined in the principles of the Constitution, mainly the disperse of power amongst the organs and institutions of government, with each being effective and having oversight over the other. This seems to have collapsed, and what appears is that at least the legislature is no longer in a position of being able to provide oversight over the executive, and therefore democratic principles within the constitutions no longer apply really.
Everyone talks about the removal of term limits, but as a constitutional expert, what exactly did that do to the Constitution? What did the removal of the term limit, how did it alter the powers of the Constitution?
Well, in a way, it's not that obvious that it alters the powers, because it could be argued that there's still a possibility for a new president to come in place, whether you have term limits or not. And these elections have shown you that there have been attempts to have a smooth succession to government through election of a new regime and a new president. The cause of problem is a long stay, the incumbency, because out of a long incumbency you get a feeling of, first of all, within the person holding that power, he or she gets to feel that he's all-knowing, and he can impose his or her will. And on the other side, people who have been working with him or her feel a bit overwhelmed, because this is someone who has a lot of incumbency experience within government. And so the situation tilts the balance tilts in favor of the presidency, who then commands a lot of respect, dignity, and can have his or her will imposed on the rest of the organs of state.
Is that the counter effect of the things we're seeing currently in the country? When we talk about the president being able to influence the legislature in the manner in which he does?
Well, that could be. It's really a perception, and in politics, perceptions are as important as realities. So when you talk about the president's being able to carry on his duties during campaigns, the perception persists that probably is using the opportunity, the duty opportunity, to have a leverage over others. So that is the power of incumbency is very strong, and can water down the intended checks and balances in the Constitution.
Professor, when you talk about checks and balances, one wonders, we saw some very grim scenes in the lead up to this election. First, the age limit amendment in the Constitution, which was designed to favor the incumbent. But the manner in which it was done, the beating of legislators in Parliament, security actually breaching Parliament quarters and beating members of Parliament in the middle of a session. We've seen the police on the road stopping opponents of the president, but not stopping the president. We've seen, even the aftermath of the election, almost 2,000 people are still missing, and many of them are allegedly taken by security officers. Would you say this is the crossroad that we've reached with the Constitution?
Well, there are certain matters that I would rather not talk about. When you talk of certain candidates being beaten up and so on, these are matters that I'm sure will feature. I don't know. I haven't read the court documents that they might feature in the presidential elections, and even presidential petitions and parliamentary petitions. What we can talk about is the manner in which the constitutional amendment, the latest important constitutional amendment was made, which was very, very unfortunate, I must say, because it looked as if the amendment was a sectarian matter, that it was intended to favor one side or the other. amendments should be done in the interests of the country, because the Constitution is the basic law. If we have to change it, we should first consult the people. But secondly, in that consultation, we should convince the people that there is a necessity in the interest of the whole country to have that amendment, which wasn't the case in respect of the age limit. But I must say myself that I'm not worried about age limit. If we had remained with the term limit, the age limit will mean nothing, really. We've seen presidents elsewhere who are 90 or approaching 100, but at least there will be a possibility that the president will reach the end.
Mm.
Yeah.
Professor, if you had to design the Constitution again, if you could be taken back to 1994, 95, what different thing would you do with the current Constitution?
I would say, you see, we had a national conversation before the Constitution was eventually promulgated. And I think if we have the opportunity, it would be better to go back and have that conversation. This Constitution now is not something that should be tinkered around by individuals. Even if you have experts who are very knowledgeable, they shouldn't pretend to know what this country wants after the experience we've had since 1995. So what would be necessary is to carry on a thorough national consultation of the people in the context of what they have seen happening after the Constitution was made. And then would come out with lasting solutions.
Mm.
Yeah.
Professor, how do you arrive at such a national conversation?
Well, in a similar manner that the law that set up the Odoch Commission did, by ensuring that there is thorough consultation of the people. You see, there are various ways of amending the Constitution. One is through Parliament, as we've seen, term limits, age limits. The other would be through someone sitting down and saying we need a change, let's have a referendum, as they are trying to do in Kenya, which is also not very appropriate, because a referendum should be on the basis of people who have been desensitized, that they know why they are voting for a change. But the conversation we had in the early 1990s is the one I'm thinking about, of thorough consultation. Because you remember the Constitutional Commission went around, sensitized the people, and then asked them for their views. These views were collected, correlated, and a report was made. On the basis of that report, a draft constitution was made, and we had elections for a People's Assembly to approve that constitution. So that is a model. We could adopt another model of consultation. We don't have to stick to that. But what I'm saying is that it will be very necessary to have views have changed. We may find that people have fundamental views on this and that aspect of governance. Mm. Yeah.
Professor, one of the other things I would like to ask you is the backdrop of that conversation you had in 1995. There had been a civil war in which the NRA took power and ruled for almost 10 years through RCs. That backdrop doesn't exist today. You don't have a civil war. But when you look out on the streets today, you have a very divided country. You have people who believe fundamentally that the establishment must go, but you also have people who believe that the establishment must stay. how do you get these two competing forces without using a civil war to have a conversation with each other?
Well, you've described exactly what should constitute the fundamentals of a conversation. Because if there are sharp differences within society, then you need to talk and come to a common position. Otherwise, these sharp differences will stay. We would have to start on a position that we want to talk in for the interest of the country. That we are now not talking like NRMs, DPs, FDCs, and so on and so on. We want to talk as Ugandans. There are so many Ugandans who have nothing to do with the political parties. Probably they are the majority in the country. Even if you ask people who shout DP and so on, how many of them have got a party card? You'll find that literally maybe about 1% of those who believe they are staunch DPs or NRMs are committed party members. So this idea of parties controlling the entire population and creating differences against the entire national interest should be talked out of the way in that conversation. And then you say, okay, you are NRM, you are DP, and so on. How have we fared in this country since the Constitution was made? Is it a problem of the Constitution or a different problem altogether? Let's see whether there are problems, discuss them, bring out to the fore, and make proposals for solution.
Mm.
So to me, I think that is almost the best situation, the one you've described, for taking on a national conversation.
Mm.
Yeah.
But Professor, these sides have shown no willingness to have a conversation. The anxiety of the young people on the street is visibly present in the way that they voted. The establishment is also still here, very strongly, using force and in some cases bribery to be able to have by consensus. How would you start such a kind of conversation? And this is where I really want to apply your thought. How would you start such a conversation? Is it something that you yourself would be pressed enough to go to the president and say, I think that we need a national conversation on this?
Well, it's not unprecedented. We've seen situations. I can describe the one in Kenya when they wanted to get out of the Moi dictatorships. And eventually there was some consensus about change, but it was resisted by government. So individuals in society, the civil society, religious groups, people who are not really active in politics, sat and began discussing about the problems of Kenya. Eventually they even resolved that they should, out of their conversation, draft a new constitution for Kenya. When it reached that stage, the state also, the government, had seen the zeal of the people. The people were supporting these groups that have had nothing to do with the politics or political parties, and said we will have also a constitutional review commission, the Guy Commission. And this people-led initiative had driven the state to that level. And eventually the government commission, saw it necessary to merge with the people-led coalition to discuss the new constitution for Kenya. So it doesn't have to be, of course, if the government is behind it, there will be an advantage of eventual legality behind, the necessary support, and so on. But at least it could be people-led, not necessarily government-led.
Mm.
You've seen the religious leaders, the elders, they have started something, what do they call it? Something, there's a national dialogue or something. Yes. And if they had the will and capacity, they could even have gone ahead and invited people, and discussion would commence that way.
Professor, you mentioned the national dialogue, and it was a really impressive initiative. But we've spoken to some of the people who should have been part of the dialogue. In the last week, for example, we spoke to retired Colonel Dr. Kizza Besigye. And he said that for any dialogue to exist, there has to be a willingness on the part of both actors involved in the dialogue to act on the things that are being dialogued about. So the hesitation itself already exists in the political establishment, that there's no willingness to act on the things that are dialogued about. How do you think that this willingness can be generated?
Well, Dr. Besigye is right. The dialogue, if any of the parties chooses to enter into the dialogue, I think the first rule of the game would be that we will be bound by the decisions of the dialogue. Otherwise, I don't see why someone should enter that dialogue. If the government was committed to a national dialogue, then there should have been commitment that the decisions will be respected and implemented. Otherwise, it will be useless for any of the parties to enter the dialogue. If I entered that dialogue as a member of a political party with a reservation that if it doesn't serve my party, I will opt out, then it's useless. So to that extent, he's right. But the point I was making, that I think his view was that the state was trying to enter that dialogue without commitment. And the point I was making, it doesn't even have to be the state in that dialogue. It can be people-led. Yes. It's a peaceful way of agitating for change. Instead of going to the streets, shouting within individual political parties without any effect, you can organize.
Professor, would you offer yourself to lead such an initiative?
It's you see, I don't know how what you mean, because leadership would spring up within that that initiative if it materializes. Maybe what you should ask is how to initiate the people-led dialogue. If it is initiated, well and good. It could be led by religious leaders, the elders, so long as it is now the people whom you are reaching and not necessarily politicians. Because politicians always have a vested interest in the status quo.
But Professor, you command enough respect from the state and from the opposition. You also command respect in the public. You've drafted a constitution before. Wouldn't you think that these are credentials if you offered yourself to lead, and if particularly you feel that we're at a crossroad, you'd save the country from a bloodbath that it is headed to?
What I'm saying is that it's not leadership that is material, and I think that is the problem of this country. We've tried, we have got into a situation where we believe that leaders are a solution. That you have a leader, you must look up to him or her for everything. This is really a very, very dangerous situation. We are glorifying leadership. When you are trying to come up with something that is democratic, you should glorify institutions. So in any dialogue, I believe you would first discuss the institutional setup that will govern the dialogue. Then you agree on structures. A structure which would mean that even if there is someone to chair the dialogue, it's not, he or she is not a commander. is not the one who decides. It is decisions that emerge through the institutions of the dialogue. And this is how government should function. Because right now we've reached a situation where people have to rush to the president. People have a small problem. The president should assist me. Of course, it's a big problem to him or her then, but it's not necessarily a presidential problem. You know, we have been evicted. The president should now come, and I think that is the situation we have reached that has killed institutions. And we shouldn't, if we have the opportunity to dialogue again, we should make sure that we don't go back to that situation. This is a serious, wrong situation.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to take a very short break. When we return, we'll speak with the professor about the election and the electoral reforms. Thank you so much for staying with On the Spot. We're still in conversation with Professor Sempebwa about the country, the voting patterns, the constitution, and the election. Professor, you were moved enough in the last election to demand a level of electoral reforms in the electoral system. Are you happy with what the court said and what was implemented before this election was held?
Well, as you recall, the court on the intervention of the dons from Makerere, the academia, as amicus curiae, made a lot of recommendations for reform. And this was the first situation where the court not only made recommendations, but made sure that the state will comply by requiring the state to come and make a report after a certain, a fixed period of time. These recommendations went, for example, to the court processes, how the evidence should be produced, whether affidavit or in addition witnesses to come and testify orally. They went to the period for filing a petition and resolving it. Then they made recommendations to amend laws to even the ground, to level the ground through use of state media and other means. And there were quite a number of others that were made. Now this, the state didn't do much. They didn't do much, almost did nothing. And as you recall, we had to go back to court to cite the Attorney General for contempt for not following the orders of the Supreme Court. And the court disagreed with us. They said the Attorney General was not in contempt. But very satisfactory to us, they went on to say, he's not in contempt, but now we give him another period of time to comply. And the additional period was given. There are a few amendments which were made. And when they were being made, I also participated with the committee on legal and parliamentary and legal affairs and made my views. For example, the date of the period of filing the petition was increased from 10 to 15 days. And to me, that is still ridiculous. I mean, for someone to collect all that evidence, because this is a national election, to collect all the evidence from Uganda and put it before court within 15 days is problematic. And I argued that there was no need to have such a short period. What are we rushing for? And the same applied to the period of decision making within the Supreme Court from 30 to 45 days. Again, so I told the committee that this is a syndrome of utter calamity unless the the winning candidate is sworn in there and then, which shouldn't be. There should be orderly succession, which means we have a candidate and there's a long period during which he or she finalizes and hands over to a newly elected president. Why the rush? We could have 6 months within which to deal with all these matters.
Do you think that has been symptomatic of the way this election petition was prepared? The Supreme Court has just made a ruling denying entry of extra evidence, and the lawyers argued that of the 15 days given to file the petition, 10 of them, the petitioner was under house arrest and unable to generate enough evidence as they need. Do you think that has been symptomatic and affected the filing of an election petition?
No, I'm only saying that I wouldn't have recommended that you know, it was a gesture of amending the Constitution. I wouldn't have recommended it. But once it is made, it becomes law. You have to avoid it. And it is constitutional law, which gives no room for extension. The Supreme Court cannot extend that period. So you can see that it's a problem. And if there is an opportunity, that should be changed drastically. So we'll not talk about the current position, but I know as a lawyer that once a period is set in the Constitution, finished.
Professor, I want us to just discuss the politics and the Constitution. All constitutions of Uganda have tended to address the question of Buganda. It's a major question that cannot be run away from. The consensus of Buganda is in very much as strong as the consensus of Uganda is. The 1995 Constitution was the first in which no special status was given to Buganda, but a recognition that it existed as one of the regions of Uganda. After this voting that just ended, there is a clear voting pattern, at least as from the results given by the Electoral Commission, that Buganda does not agree with the establishment. What is your own perception of the outcome of what the results as they came? What's your perception of that?
Well, the Buganda question is always on the table. And the problem, it is used by all politicians in their own way. If Buganda, we can now talk about Buganda, not Baganda. If Buganda votes in a certain manner that favors me, I keep quiet, it's all right. But if they vote against me, then I'll have some issues to raise. Why has Buganda voted against me, and so on and so on and so on. But let's forget that we are now talking about the center. Many activities go on, economic activities and political activities go on, are visible within the center. They go on elsewhere, but those are peripheral, as one might say. So activity is visible around here. And therefore, people become even more sensitized about rights, about development, and so on and so on. And democracy. So it's quite possible that people within the center will have a certain pattern of voting to secure their interests. They may not necessarily be Baganda interests. I'm a Muganda, but our traditional interests are well known. The federalism, security of Kabakaship, and security of our land, blah, blah, blah. But this will not necessarily feature in a national election. What is bound to feature are the matters, the issues that are of direct impact on people's lives. And this is an area where those are very visible and can influence the voting pattern. So it would be wrong to say that this is what happened is a sectarian vote. If it was, then how do you explain the Baganda voting against Baganda and removing them from power? And how do you explain Baganda voting for non-Baganda within the same polity? They even voted for someone they didn't know. I think there's a member of parliament in Makindi or something.
Derek Nyaku.
And when you interviewed some of the voters there, they were asking, who is he? But we voted for him. So anyway, that's the situation. I'm not denigrating the Buganda issue. Buganda issue is always in the front in Buganda. It can be used and abused. It was abused in the 60s, and for some of us who are old enough, we would not like to go back to that situation where the Buganda issue is being abused. We don't want to be told we should vote because we are Baganda, but I would like to be told vote because these are the issues. Poverty, lack of medicines in the whatever, the roads are rotten, and so on and so on. Those are matters that touch me. But they will touch you whether you are Muganda or not.
Professor, in 1960, before we got the 1962 constitution, there had been hostility between Buganda and the establishment. In 1970, before the coup d'etat, still the same hostility existed between Buganda and the establishment. It was sort of resolved in the 1980s after the Civil War happened. Now it's seemingly coming back to the forefront. Would you say that we are back to olden times? Would you say that these are the same hostilities that existed before, or that these are now new hostilities that have been born out of the election?
That's exactly what I've just said, that the Buganda question can be abused. And we don't want to go back to that. We saw the 60s where many Baganda were misled out of democracy, for example, thinking that the Buganda interests will be better protected through processes that were not democratic. We've seen, we went through that so-called sectarian situation, where if you are not apparently in support of the Meng establishment, you are enemy of Baganda. So that is a gone. We've moved beyond that. And anyone, for example, the president is very alive to this, and he talks about it. That is a situation we don't want to go back to. But if in the same breath you interpret the vote, the current vote, as a sectarian vote, then you are dragging us back to that situation which we don't want. There's no area that is being always nationalistic like Uganda. No one can dispute that. Because who lives in Buganda? Not only Baganda. Who pays allegiance to the Kabaka? Not only Baganda. So this place has always been a nation, and it should be treated as a model of a nation. And playing the sectarian card is dangerous. It's leading us to a situation where we may have a lot of problems, a lot of havoc. Yeah.
Professor, in 1995, of course, recalling the times that we had come out of, you entrenched a provision of the Constitution, which is freedom from torture, degrading and inhuman treatment. We've just run a week of stories on NTV where people have been picked up, tortured. The famous drone van, which is picking people, taking them and torturing them, The National Unity Platform says almost 2,000 of their supporters are missing. The Uganda Human Rights Commission tells us they don't have the capacity to investigate all the disappearances. But a minister for security has spoken to Parliament. Internal Affairs actually has spoken to Parliament and said some of the people who were kidnapped by members of security forces. Do you worry about where we are now with that particular provision?
Yes, it's a cause for worry for any Ugandan right-thinking mind. It's a cause for worry. During Amin's time, these are matters that used to occur regularly, and they led to so many Ugandans running away. They led eventually to a combination of Ugandans and foreigners to topple Amin. So we thought that we had gone out of that situation, and it is a cause for worry. And you see, the life of any person is very valuable. We don't have to reach a situation where we say people have not died as much as they died during Amin's, so we are better off. No, we are not. Any life that is unaccounted for is a grave matter. And therefore, I'm worried. I'm worried. And you cannot explain it that because of elections, therefore there is these kidnaps, there are arrests which are unexplained. People are found with firearms which have are not apparent. So it's a cause for worry, yes. But coming back to what you were saying, the Constitution, that is the practice I talked about before. We've entrenched provisions. But if there is no commitment in practice, the letter of the Constitution becomes useless. It becomes useless. You can say everyone has a right to life, but if people are killed, people are dying of hunger, lack of medicines and so on, the right to life within the Constitution doesn't mean much.
Does that then mean to generate consensus against, for example, the use of security in elections? Would you then ask for things like that? Would you ask for an amendment like that?
Yes, and it's not, I don't think that an amendment is really the solution. It can appear there. It is already within the rules, the laws. The role of the security forces is clarified within the Constitution. The police for law and order, peace. The people's defense for securing the sovereignty of the country. And the prison service for correctional measures. That is there. Now the practice only differs depending on what people in leadership perceive the situation to demand. If I'd been in leadership, I would have thought an election might invoke some argument, some breach of peace. I would deploy the police to intervene in a manner that is proportionate to the threat. Any other security agency shouldn't be necessary because they have their own role within the laws, the Constitution and the law. So I don't think we need even to indulge in amending the Constitution. It's simply, these are matters for the dialogue to see how in future government should behave, and we agree. If there are any tightening needed within the rules, the laws, then we can agree on it. Yeah.
Would you say the power of incumbency is the one that's rubbing off to create all of this that we are seeing currently?
That is possible. We've seen it everywhere, that regimes that last long get the feeling of entitlement. It has happened in Tanzania recently. From 2015, the government of Magufuli thought it was wrong to return to multi-party politics and continued to stifle the freedoms of political parties and so on. Then in elections, it was made clear through use of the military, the police, and so on, that opposition candidates were not very welcome on the playing field. So this syndrome of the one-party state lingers on in Tanzania, and it's because of the long incumbency of that political regime. So that can explain it, unfortunately for many of the political parties in Africa have no real basis, no root within the populace. They have a root within the leadership, which uses various means of benefiting people who think they will vote for them. And once there is a change, the political party collapses. But I agree with you, the incumbency is an important factor.
Professor, how do we midwife a transition in Uganda?
The only way of, if you mean looking for orderly succession to government, for which we have provided, we did, as Ugandans, we provided in the Constitution, then the practice should be through respecting institutions within government, within political organizations. Because if that is respected, leadership will naturally emerge. Are our political parties, for example, are they democratic? They're supposed to be under the laws. To be democratic, lead in changes of leadership. They should be the first ones to show respect for democracy, changes and leadership. But if you have all political parties who feel that they cannot do without X or Y, they keep maintaining him or her in power, then what you are talking about will not emerge. So even in this case, it is respect for institutions, changes at the state level, respected, term limits, and democracy within the leadership of political organizations. And respect, of course, for people's rights to vie for position of leadership, at even the national level. Then if in the absence of that, there will be chaos. So you can see what I'm talking about. If a leading political party, like NRM claims to be, does not have clear institutional mechanisms for changing leadership, all they suffer the burden of incumbency. By looking at this fellow is the only one that we can have. Then there's a problem. Because if you are in a position of leadership and you can't change leadership at that level, the country also can suffer a problem. Yeah.
Is this an NRM problem alone? Is it a problem that NRM alone has to address in terms of transition?
I talked about every political party must comply with the rules of a democracy.
No, Professor, I mean in the sense that transitioning Uganda's presidency, it's been here for 35 years. I'm only 28, I've only seen one government. Is it an NRM only problem to midwife a transition, or it also must involve, at the very level now, citizens? And there's a lot of agitation, you see it on the streets. There's opinion polls where people say they would very love to have another president, but if Museveni offers himself on the ballot, then they are willing to vote for him.
Yes, now that what you have described becomes an NRM problem. Because if there's no change there, then people like you, who have not seen anything else, will probably keep voting, because keep voting for the NRM candidate. But it's not only an NRM problem. This is a problem for all of us, that if there are institutions, you've seen it, the changes are clear now. Formerly, it was a duo between people who participated in the Bush War. But now, people young as you are have come up, because you've not, the Bush War doesn't mean much to you people. Neither does this history of sectarianism, the Mengo, whatever. That means something to us, the elders. We are the ones who suffered during those times and so on. So the change is glaring. If we respect the people's right to participate, definitely there can be a transition. It might not be smooth because of the incumbency. The people who have stayed in power for a long time might not feel comfortable being replaced, even through the vote. It's natural. It's natural. Yeah.
Professor, let's talk about government legitimacy. In the Constitution, there's no provisions for this, but if you have 18 million voters and only 57% of those show up, and of those 57, only about 58% choose who becomes the leader, is that a legitimate government that would be envisioned under a constitution?
Yeah, constitutionally there's nothing much you can do about that. It is a worrying trend. It could arise because many of us have not played our role. To begin with, the Constitution has a crucial role in sensitizing the people about the value of elections, how to conduct them. Then political parties also have a crucial role. They shouldn't simply limit themselves to the election season, because our activities seem to glare up during the election season, the immediate pre-polling season. Civil society and all of us concerned citizens, it's incumbent upon us to sensitize the people. But we don't, and this is what is happening. There are a number of things we can do, we can talk about to make sure that people participate popularly. But when we have time, we can actually go into those.
All right, let's take a very short break. We're still in conversation with Professor Sempebwa. When we get back, we'll discuss more about the transition question. Welcome back to NTV On The Spot, and we're still in conversation with Professor Frederick Sempebwa on matters of national importance. Professor, the land question. It was a key matter when you were formulating the Constitution about people and access to their land. Over the years now, you've had development which has created a middle class, and as a result of that, more of the middle class is buying out poor people from their lands, and they're being aided and enabled by state agencies to carry out evictions. Some people feel that these evictions are unlawful, and in many cases some of these evictions are unlawful, but it's seemingly becoming a national conversation now on access to land, use of land, buying and selling of land. What are your own thoughts about where we are now on such a vital matter of a factor of production?
Land will continue to be a point for discussion, mainly because it's a limited resource. Many of the other resources can be multiplied, but there's no way you can add to the land mass for which Ugandans are entitled. You can encroach on the lake, but there's a limit to that. You can encroach on the swamps, there's a limit to that. So this is going to be an increasingly scarce resource. But there are a number of actions that we could take as Ugandans to ensure that this scarce resource is utilized in an optimum manner. For example, the rules about succession to land, which are paternalistic in many of our areas, that land is left to the children and divided up. I have 10 acres of land. I die and the children divide up. If there are 10 children, that means 1 acre.
1 acre per child.
And optimal use of 10 acres is quite different if managed properly than optimal use of 1 acre. But also the problem is that all those children will not probably have the capacity to utilize this land optimally, and therefore they start disposing of it in even smaller parcels. So that's something we have to look at and see whether, despite this love of succession and so on, we can have changes in these rules. It's difficult because of our economic patterns, but we should try. I would have thought that the commission chaired by Judge would have come out with policies. Unfortunately, this commission spent a lot of its time trying to catch land thieves, whereas its terms of reference were to come up with policies for optimal use of land and to prevent conflicts that are arising. They are arising because it's a scarce resource. The second cause of problems is historical, because in parts of the country, the occupiers of the land and those who originally became owners were different. The occupiers were on the ground, the owners waived legal titles. But that situation changed when the original owners died out, and the new owners are people who purchased or inherited and subdivided. But that historical element is still there. That's the Vivanja question, which I think would also be dealt with by new policies that protect the owners and the occupiers.
Professor, a lot of the land question is becoming a political question too, and that's because a lot of productive land is actually within the center of Uganda. 75% of our GDP is being made in the center of Uganda. And a lot of people migrating from other parts of the country and coming here and becoming middle class want to own part of that productive land. As a political question, how should it be addressed? I hear you saying policies, that's an economic question. But as a political question, how should it be addressed?
The political question is clear. Every Ugandan is free to move, should be free, by the way, should be free to move anywhere in any part of Uganda, acquire property there and develop. So that one is foregone unless there is a national consensus. Otherwise, you cannot prevent that. if there are deliberate moves of dispossessing entire communities, that is wrong. That sort of politics is wrong, because people should be free to either maintain their ownership or dispose of it at arm's length. The political question arises because of poverty. Many of our people have been disempowered economically, and therefore the question of disposal of their only small assets is dictated by poverty. This is why it becomes a political question, that how do we now ensure that people are empowered economically, they can maintain their land and develop it. Because Africa have real big attachment, serious attachment to their land. So even in this area where economic activities are centered, it's about the same situation as elsewhere. If you go beyond Mukono, you go to Kayunga, Galilaya, and so on, the same problem occurs. It is people are disempowered economically, and the solution is there. When I was growing, we had strong cooperative societies which really empowered the people. The people would stay in the areas, produce in the secure position that what they produce will find a market through their cooperatives. They would get advice through their cooperatives, and no one would fool around with them, bribing them 1,000. We had in remote areas, people are being given 1,000 as they are about to line up for voting. 1,000 shillings. It's not in the center, but all those areas. So the political economic position cannot be separated. In fact, the economy dictates the politics.
Professor, I want us to spend the last minutes talking about your legacy. What legacy do you think you will have left behind for Uganda?
Well, that is not for me to decide.
but definitely,
that is
when you sit back at night, there's some things you say, I've done this for my country.
That is for others to decide. If you want me to brag, yes, I can brag. I can say I've made my contribution. I have taught, produced lawyers for the community, not only Uganda, but in Zambia and in Tanzania, where I also taught. So I have served the country without much reward, by the way. Not as much as what Parliament, in fact, for nothing, let me say.
Yes.
In various capacities, including the drafting, service on the Constitutional Commission or Dutch Commission, chairing the Constitutional Review Commission. I served the Kenyans because I also served on the Committee of Experts that drafted the final version of their constitution. So I served Uganda, but I served the region as well, the East African region. Where I think I have failed is that I have not mentored our lawyers sufficiently. I have served on institutions which are supposed to ensure that we have good professionals joining us. We have somehow failed, not necessarily as individuals, but because we have not had the support of the state in regulating the production of lawyers. We've had situations where training institutions just spring up, and in my capacity as part of the regulatory authority, trying to intervene, but with a lot of opposition from state agencies, and outcry that probably are trying to ring fence the profession and so on. So I have failed in some of my endeavors.
You try to midwife an opposition unity, and we still see opposition trying to unify at the moment. Would you say that it's something that works better for the democracy if you have a united opposition? And why did you lend yourself to it in the first place?
Well, I lent myself to it because I thought this was the first chance to have a principled unity. I think a unity which is trying to win an election is useless, and I wouldn't support it. And once what you are talking about, TDA, became a unity that was trying to win an election, I knew it was bound to collapse, and I left. And I wouldn't indulge in myself in any unity that is geared to winning an election. Principled unity is that you come together and discuss how to improve the conditions of our people in the country. And you continually do this, you encourage, you try and secure resources to ensure that the people's lives are uplifted. If in the process you can organize politically and win an election, at least you have set up the ground rules for holding the country together, for having a new dispensation to replace the old one. That sort of unity I would still support. Mm-hmm. But you see, our political leaders normally have their eyes on an election. Beyond that, look at this season. Once it ends, you will see activities which involve the people are limited to those that can garner some support for the next election. Mm-hmm. I will attend a burial or this and that because I need to maintain my stance as a popular leader. Mm-hmm. If the roads are wasted, if I can vote myself increases in remuneration at the expense of hospitals and so on, that doesn't matter, so long as my position is secure. So this is an education that we have to carry out, not among the political leaders themselves, but even among our people, to tell them what is the role of your representative. Your representative is not supposed to care about your sick child or to attend funerals and so on and so on. No, your representative has a national role and a local constitutional role, which is subservient to the national role. But these are matters for a dialogue. Yeah.
Did you imagine that politics would become transactional this much far in time?
Not really. I grew up in a situation where there was no, politics was not monetized at all. We had a situation in the 60s, I was young of course, but a situation where people voted you because of the political party to which you belong. Again, there was some flaw in it, but at least there was no money involved. It was because you are DP or UPC that you are voted, or Kabaka Eka. But no money, no, this is a new challenge I don't know how we deal with it. We may even have to produce, to change laws to penalize apparent excessive spendings and so on and so on, as done in some countries. It is a situation that is getting out of hand. Anyone who has participated in this election, parliamentary, district, or lower levels, will tell you that now they are poor.
the amount of money they spend.
Yes.
Do you think that affects the quality of legislation that we have today?
Definitely, because if you came in, you invested so much money in becoming a people's representative, then you are looking at ways of getting back your investment. Where will you get it from? If you can be subservient to the other powers and get some money out of it, you will. You will succumb to that. If there is an element of corruption within the legislative processes, you may succumb because you have to recoup your investment. So why should people invest massively in service to the public if that is the intention? It's not the intention. It's simply that I have to invest and then recoup, get back my investment with a profit.
Professor, another perfectly legal way in which Parliament is being subverted lately, caucus meetings of Parliament. Parties have caucus meetings, make deliberations, and come up to the floor of Parliament with an agreed position. Do you think that that has taken away from the strength of Parliament, considering that for all the years under the Constitution, the NRM has been the dominant party ever since the multi-party politics returned?
In a multi-party system, you cannot prevent caucuses, party caucuses, because each party, especially the party in power, would like to see that the policies of a government are implemented through laws and so on. So you can't prevent that. What you should work with is to ensure that members of political parties are principled, that they will support their party position to the extent that is in the party in the national interest, not only the party interest. And there should be avenues of differences, of differing of opinion without penalization, which has not grown up in Africa really, because if I talk against the views of my party, I'm penalized, even if my views are more in the interest of the nation. Caucuses you can't prevent, but what we should work for is principled decisions and the possibility of differing on principle.
Professor, if I could ask you very finally, the document of the 1995 Constitution, are you happy with the Uganda it has produced today? And if you could change the Uganda it has produced, what would you change about it?
I'm not happy, but the entire problem is not because of the document. The practice of implementing that document, the practice of government has ensured that all the ideals enshrined in this document have fallen by the way. If we had the opportunity, we would look at the document again. We could even be surprised that there are not too many changes that we would make within the document as such. What we would need to do is to agree on the principles of respecting the institutions that the document sets up and living by the principles within the document. So I don't think that the Constitution should be the one to blame. It is with the people, the way we have practiced the democracy enshrined in that Constitution. So I would say if we have the opportunity, we should look at it again. Not in the context of the document as it is, but in the context of how we have lived by it and what has caused us to be in a position where we are.
Would a civilian leader act differently with that document? differently from the way military leader acts?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The seeds of dictatorship are within all of us, you and me. And if they are allowed to germinate, they will sprout. They don't have to, you don't have to be a military person. This is why we have constitutions. We have a dictatorship can grow out of popularity. That your person comes to power with strong popular support, and he feels he or she can do anything. So it doesn't matter whether you have a military background or not. There are good leaders who have had military backgrounds in the States or elsewhere. And we have had dictators who have never touched a gun. So your answer to your question, no, it wouldn't.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us. We've been speaking to Professor Frederick Sempebwa, who is a constitutional lawyer, but also one of the fathers of our 1995 Constitution. And he's given us a great amount of his time. Thank you so much for tuning in also to NTV On The Spot. Have yourselves a good evening.